Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the How To Academy. My name is David Malone. It's my great pleasure this evening to talk to two wonderful thinkers. First, Noga Arikha, who is a philosopher, historian of ideas. She's Associate Fellow at the Warburg Institute, the Center for the Politics of Feeling, and the Institute Jean-Nicot, and also Professor Antonio Damasio, who is a Professor of Psychology, Philosophy, and Neurology at the University of Southern California. Welcome to you both. And we're here to discuss Noga's new book, The Ceiling Outside, The Science and Experience of the Disrupted Mind. And it's a wonderful book. It's beautifully written. It was challenging to read because the stuff you cover is challenging, but beautiful to read. And it's a very personal book. It's a book about the self, and what you say quite early on, you say it's about what it takes to construct a self, what it means to lose oneself, and how one can find oneself again. And it is quite a personal book, isn't it, Noga? Could you, tell us about the writing of it, because it rather changed as you wrote it, didn't it?
It's true, it did. Thank you. First of all, thanks it's wonderful to be here. It's a great honor to be here with Antonio Damasio, who's without whom I should say at the outset, a lot of the science that the science that I'm interested in, probably that is happening now to understand the sense of self, probably wouldn't have happened quite in the same way, and whose work has been extremely important for me. So this is, and for me and for many scientists and philosophers. So I should say this at the outset. It's very meaningful to be here with you, Antonio. The book started off as the little elevator pitch, saying, what are you writing about? I was the science as it studies itself and how it studies itself and how it loses itself has been the where to sum up what I was interested in, really trying to understand what is this sense of self. Starting off really with this notion that it is permanently embodied, that it cannot be thought of as a pure mind. Precisely this Cartesian dualism is over, and actually, again, Antonio was instrumental in the 90s in really showing us how, and we'll talk about this, how this is, how we are embodied selves in a profound way. And I started sitting in on these sessions of, I was given the opportunity to sit in on sessions of clinical sessions, weekly clinical sessions at the Petit-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris of neuropsychiatry patients. Completely anonymously, I was sitting in and was able to hear the stories of these various people whose diagnosis was a bit, rather ambiguous or ambivalent. Didn't quite know what was going on with them. And the sessions were extraordinary in that they were extremely long. There were maybe 2 or 3 per morning for over 3 hours or 4 hours sometimes, and that was it, maximum. The discussions were long, the examinations were long, and it was almost like it was a real lesson in neurology as well. There were neurologists and psychiatrists in the room who had created this this unit precisely to put together neurology and psychiatry, to really talk across actually a border that had been let's say come to be precisely in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when neurology and psychiatry became divided. And we can talk about that later as well. And then I realized that the science I was really interested in psychology and neuroscience, that is really about the embodied sense of self, was really helpful to try to understand what was going on with these patients, even though it wasn't used in a clinical setting. So I brought that science to bear on the stories, really, on my telling and understanding of these stories. And they're all really, the science is really in the endnotes, the 20,000 words of endnotes that are really the hardcore ground of this. And as I was writing, that's a third level, as I was writing, I realized my own mother could have been a patient because she was clearly developing dementia. So it's also a book about that. What is the sense of self in dementia, and what is happening to herself? And I realized that the science helped me understand her as well as the patients, and the patients helped me understand the science as well as her, that she helped me understand the patients, and everybody helped. I mean, everything was like a really interconnected unit. That's the book that happened, really.
And memory is something that runs through the entire book from beginning to end, that what we make of memory, how it relates to who we are. And you link it very much to imagination, that it's not a sort of a passive thing, like looking up 3x5 cards in a little index. That memory is something much more active.
It's dynamic.
Yeah, and that very much relates to Antonio's work
exactly.
as well.
So maybe, yeah.
And both of you, your work does get at this link, as you say, you use the word embodied, and I think it's worth trying to unpack what we mean by that it's not just an intellect which could be floating around. How did that play out in the people whose cases you sat in on?
Well, all of them had some issue with memory at some level, which is not the same thing as a sense of self, but the memory helps to constitute what the self is. Maybe we can talk about this. I mean, this is exactly what well, of course, dementia is a particular case in point. In the case of my mother, was most probably, we didn't test for biomarkers, but was most probably Alzheimer's. And her long-term, her autobiographical memory really disintegrated.
And that's
but her
really central.
Core self, which is a notion that you've developed, Antonio, the idea of the core self, which actually is all talked about also in here, which I have the book, did not actually disappear. So this is the experience I had, and I think a lot of people have that experience with Alzheimer's, for example.
Yeah, I think that distinction is very important, because very often when people think about notions such as self or consciousness in general, people think about it as something, a particular singular phenomenon, and that's not the case. Consciousness can be extremely small and can be extremely large. For example, right now the three of us have a very rich conception, which is present in the back of our minds, about the universe, about who we are, about the fact that we are in 3 different places, across continents. It's a notion of consciousness that is broad, it's cinemascopic, it includes images of all kinds, not just visual, that are very pronounced, or auditory, but also other images that are coming from our other senses, sense of touch, for example, smell, and then it includes translations of all of this imagetic product in language, and sometimes in the case of the 3 of us, because we have more than one language in our minds, there are even translations that sometimes going on. So it's an extremely rich universe that is hooked on memory, the memory of our past, obviously, and memories that are actually sometimes very recent of things that happen. Again, in the case of the 3 of us, because we have just been, prior to the beginning of the session, we have just been connecting through the internet, so that there are all of these memories that are being formed and retained for some time. But then you also have a conception of consciousness that is and should be extremely simple. And it has to do, in my sort of most cleaned out, transparent definition at the moment, which is something that Hannah, my wife, and I have been cooking for a while. It's simply the referral of one's mind to one's body. It's as simple as that. To be conscious means that I am automatically aware of the fact that my mind belongs here in my body, and that the 2 are together. One belongs to the other. It's about co-ownership, cross-referral. That is the basics of consciousness. And none of this great edifice that I just described about the universe that we have in our minds would exist and would make any sense if there would not be that very simple process of connecting a mind and a body, so that my mind is not floating around in some crazy place. My mind is in my body. And that really, just to finish this long story, it really hooks on feeling, and on feeling of a particular kind, which is homeostatic feelings. It hooks on feelings as simple as hunger, thirst, well-being, pain, desire. Things that are not feelings that relate to emotions, that don't relate to fear or anger or joy or sadness. They relate to the state of our life in our bodies. It's simply a note card that our organisms are sending to the mind about the fact that this is either going very well, don't worry, or things are going wrong, such as in the case of pain, or please help in the case of hunger or thirst, or even the simplest of the homeostatic feelings, which is the feeling of life itself. It's the feeling of existence, which people very often don't notice. It's very subtle, but even if you're not in hunger, thirst, pain, desire, whatever, all of that long list of homeostatic feelings, you are feeling yourself. You know that you exist. And that is a feeling. And that comes to you through a sort of depuration of what's in your body, in your life at that moment. And the feeling of existence is wonderful because it's simply telling you that things are not so bad. Things are going reasonably well. We're not in great needs, not in great satisfactions. We're just going along pretty well.
And that's the feeling of the body, the internal state of the body is called interoception. And there's a lot of research that's happening. It's growing hugely and it's becoming more and more important. And this is exactly the theoretical apparatus that I really have used as well to try to understand what's going wrong. And it's interesting that the sense of being alive is a beautiful thing. I think that most patients that I saw certainly had that intact. But it can go wrong. For example, Cotard patients and people who feel like they're dead inside, that actually can happen. And those, I think a lot of the disruptions in the basic, in the history of neuroscience and also of neurology really is basically is taking, what goes wrong can help us understand what has gone right. And I think in a lot of these patients, something had gone wrong and what normally goes right, and helps us really understand what it takes for this feeling of a life of consciousness to be constantly constructed. And it is a dynamic process, right? It's a constant adjustment, homeostatic adjustment to a constantly changing environment so that we can actually feel that we can actually flourish, or at least stay alive and flourish within this environment and become.
And it is so interesting because, for example, in relation to the central figure in the book, your mother, it's quite clear that while due to the memory impairments, while some of those more complex aspects of consciousness were being destroyed or at least impaired, the core sense of self was maintained. So that sense, that link of her mind to her body was maintained. So that's extremely robust, and that was there and probably was there all through the end. It's the rest is all of the flourishings that we have around and that we have constructed and that we operate on the day to day. And it was good that you mentioned the word interoception to say something that this comes from the most recent work that we have been doing. We have been calling attention to the fact that interoception is not just the partner to exteroception. So it's quite clear when you use the deception in extra or intro, of course, has to do with perception. And everybody understands that when you talk about exteroception, we're thinking about, for example, visual or auditory perceptions. And very often when you use the term interoception, the first thing that people think is that, well, this is perception of the interior. And I have to tell you that for a long time, this is exactly what I did. I talked about, if I would be talking to in a lecture, I would say interoception is the equivalent of exteroception, except that it's looking inside rather than outside. And that is very curious because it's actually wrong. And interoception is not about perception of the interior. It's really about an interaction between so-called mind processes and processes that are in the interior and are not even neural. So if you think about interoception as an interaction, you realize that feelings are hybrids. Feelings are not really perceptions of the interior. There's something else. And that something else happens to be, and I claim this now very strongly, I started timidly in this last book, Feeling and Knowing, but now it's even more marked. Feelings are the inaugural events of consciousness in biological evolution. Just think of it. The first time the creature had a feeling of pain, that feeling had to be conscious, or it would not have been of any use for the creature. So when you first had hunger or thirst or pain or well-being, that, what I call that report card on the state of your life, had to be made automatically, spontaneously conscious, or it wouldn't serve any purpose. And because it was spontaneously conscious, that people could take hold of it and do something about what was needed: eat, drink, run for cover because you are in pain. So the consciousness was a necessity with feeling, and feeling came rolled into it. And that is what I think that biological evolution took the opportunity to select this, and it became, of course, a central feature of complex creatures. Provided they have a nervous system and they have a certain amount of complexity, they are going to have these homeostatic feelings. And we humans, of course, have them in spades, but that comes much later. You don't need to be human to have homeostatic feelings, obviously. But so the idea that this provides a revelation of what's inside, and that all of this incredible edifice of consciousness was really through and through about maintaining life, and about all the manipulations that biology went through to arrange systems that would maintain life regulation, and that would call attention to the need to have life regulation. So you could even say that one has minds first and foremost because you need to attend to your life, or else you're going to be in trouble. And so this puts things in a different logic. And more often than not, people have approached the idea of consciousness from the top, which is one reason why people get into the drama of saying that's a hard problem that you cannot solve, and that there's absolutely no way into the mystery of consciousness. And that's because you start from the top and you make it more complex than it needs to be. Start from the bottom and you will realize the beautiful logic of this all. And it had to be logic, it had to be useful, otherwise it wouldn't be here, and we would not be here either.
It's interesting. Actually, it's funny because I know I explicitly say in the book, and actually the first endnote, that I'm not talking about consciousness in my book. Yours is yours, Feeling and Knowing, is explicitly about. Mine is explicitly not, which is actually great. And of course, what's in the middle of this is the self, the human self. But I take for granted in a way. Of course, it's that we are evolved animals, and what you see playing out also in all our states, where there are states of well-being or states of pathology, which we can also define what pathology is indeed exactly those processes you're talking about, which are very ancient processes. And I love the way you've been saying this also for a long time, this how all this comes out of bacteria. I mean, we are really basically evolved with bacteria. We are evolved single cell organisms whose mechanisms are still happening, within at a obviously multicellular, extremely complex.
Noga, can I ask you a question? Because on top of what Antonio is talking about, what runs through the book is we are all those things Antonio is talking about, but we have the ability to tell stories. And what is there throughout your book is that people tell themselves stories about how they feel.
Yeah.
And when things go wrong, sometimes the story that they report is at odds with how you saw them or their doctors saw them. So there is something about, there's a lovely bit in the book where you say sometimes these illnesses are a way of your body trying to tell you that something is not right.
Yeah.
But the stories themselves become fascinating, like the chapter about Hold My Hand. It's terribly moving. Tell us a little bit about that story, because it spoke such a lot about what Antonio is saying and what you're saying about the importance of the story that gets told by people.
Yeah,